So it's really a pleasure to be here to attend the inauguration of this new Integrative Computational Neuroscience Center. Of course, MIT is a special place in this field. I thought I would mention that Nobel winner, pioneered what's called cybernetics here at MIT. And this year is also the 40th anniversary of the publication by David Marr, the book called Vision, which is still very much influencing neuroscience and cognitive science. If you're familiar with David Marr's work, you probably mostly remember, especially younger people, that he was really a pioneer in computational cognitive science, mostly from computational perspective. But maybe it's good to mention that he has deep roots in neurobiology. When he was an undergraduate student, he published this series of 3 papers, really seminal papers, on theories of hippocampus, cerebellum, and neocortex based on anatomy, based on the circuits. Unfortunately, he passed away at a young age of 35. As Francis Crick, who knew him, stated, had he lived longer, he would have moved to a synthesis of those 2 approaches. So perhaps today we can together start to think about how we can help to realize that vision of a synthesis. Of course, today we're living in an era where AI pervades all aspects of society. Just to mention that, although today's AI systems are tremendously successful in solving certain problems better than humans, you could say that if it's purely feed-forward architecture, then when there's no external input, the system is essentially silent, right? It doesn't do anything. So in that sense, you could say that this type of systems don't really have a mental life. Okay. By contrast, thinking, reasoning, planning, somehow this went away. This microphone stopped working. Oh, maybe Michael, it did something. But this stopped working.
Yeah, they turned that off.
Oh, you want me to use this now?
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, great. Okay, sure. That's good. That solves the problem. Either way. Good.
Can you turn them down just a little?
No problem. No, this is great. Yeah. Right.
This is Massachusetts Institute of Technology.
Well, I just hope that Robert will give me 5 more minutes. So I was saying that reasoning, thinking, planning, right, feeling something from your fond memory, are essentially internal processes that are really not enslaved to the environment. And so those processes depend on some brain structures, especially what's called the prefrontal cortex. Right? So maybe a challenge for us is to think about building, theory of, deep recurrent neural networks that are capable of this more kind of internally driven processes, right? Important for mental life. So, if you try to think into the future, right? What kind of, measure of success for such a model we could think about? I would just mention one thing, repeating what I just said. Basically, a machine, right, with human-like intelligence should, in principle, without any external stimulation, have something like, reasoning, using logic, maybe creating something new, and perhaps even emotional feelings, out of memory. So I'm going to tell you a bit about how we start to think about this type of internally driven processes. First, a little bit of summary about the microcircuits that we have been thinking about, and then spend more time, as Robert mentioned, on our recent work building multi-regional large-scale models. So we kind of pay attention to connectomics, anatomy, and neuron physiology, and the biophysically based models end up being nonlinear dynamical systems. Let me just give you, for those of you who are not familiar with what we do, a very simple example. Imagine that you are asked to make a perceptual decision-making where you are shown a display of random dots, and your judgment is whether the net motion of the stimulus is A upward or B downward. Right? So you can think about a little microcircuit where you have neuron groups or neuron assemblies, A or B. Within each, there is strong recurrent excitation between pyramidal cells, and then the two neuron groups compete against each other. So what's interesting about this type of model, I think, is this duality. So on one hand, I don't know if you can actually do I have a pointer? Maybe I just use the cursor. As you see on the right, on one hand, you see this a very slow transient in the form of quasi-linear ramping activity up to a second, which has been shown in single neuron physiology to underline accumulation of information, accumulation of evidence in favor or against the different options, here A or B. And on the other hand, there's also categorical choice by winner-take-all competition done by attractor dynamics, right, in this model. And the same mechanism can sustain activity when the stimulus is gone, so you can hold in working memory your choice for later use, right? And also, as Eli mentioned, I'm very happy to hear, is that one big challenge to understand the brain is cross-level understanding, right? So this kind of model, try to move in that direction. So in this case, starting with recurrent dynamics, you can ask, what's the mechanism underlying slow transients, right? It turns out in this case, it's NMDA-dependent recurrent excitation. So this is something you can test, right, using some drugs or, agonist or, antagonist. On the other hand, you can go up, right? Look at psychometric function to be compared with behavioral measurements in the experiments. So this line of research has led to the idea that, although the scheme looks like universal, right? It could be V1 model, but somehow under certain conditions, the same kind of circuit can underline cognitive kind of computations like working memory and decision making. So over the last almost two decades now, we have been exploring different kind of building blocks of cognition. I would say Robert Young's work in his PhD really kind of represents where we are now. So we ask the question about how a local circuit in PFC, for example, can underline so many tasks, right? So that way you can start to ask questions like how abstract task representation really is realized by neural circuits. I guess one of the open questions in this line of work is what is the dynamical nature of internal states underlying working memory and decision making. I just want to make a point, that when we say attractor states, we don't mean necessarily steady states, right? So those are two examples where you can have stochastic oscillations in a network, right? That are attractor states. Maybe for physicists, even turbulence is actually described as an attractor state by Navier-Stokes equation, right? So those are very complex spatial temporal patterns, but they are attractor states. So, but what is exactly the nature of spatial temporal neural activity patterns that are important for internal mental processes is not known, right? So that we try to start to think about that, but the temporal aspect of the things is really a very interesting, still underexplored direction. But for the rest of the talk, I will kind of move on to the spatial aspect of cognitive functions, because we now know, and we become more and more aware, that even working memory of simple stimuli involves multiple brain regions. So this is a meta-analysis figure showing along the axis different cortical areas in macaque monkey, how likely you would see delay activity in red in individual experimental studies. So it's not uniform, right, across all cortical areas. Certain areas seem to be engaged in working memory more permanently than the others. But on the other hand, it's also distributed, right? And also, Miller, for example, showed that if you simultaneously record from multiple brain regions, in this case, 6 or so cortical areas in macaque monkey, in a simple decision task, you also see very distributed processes, right? So it's a puzzle, right? How can we understand distributed working memory in decision making? So I would say it's timely to raise this question because of the advances, of experimental tools and the measurements, right? So I'm going to tell you a story from my lab where we collaborated with Henry Kennedy, an anatomist in France, who relatively recently published a database of inter-area connectivity in macaque cortex. So basically, I'm skipping some details, but just to tell you that they had a way to assess directed and weighted connectivity between cortical areas. If you plot the statistics of the weights in the upper right panel, you would see 5 orders of magnitude range of the weight values that's fit with a log normal distribution. And also in the lower right panel is shown the weight of connection between 2 areas as a function of the distance between the 2, right? Semi-log plot, meaning that the network is really spatially embedding. It depends on spatial proximity between areas, not a pure topological graph, as you would describe with a graph theory. So imagine that you take this connectivity matrix to build a dynamic model of many interacting, macaque cortex areas. By the way, I also should mention that there's a lot of feedback projections. About 65 of all possible connections are present, right? So it's kind of a tense connection at this level of cortical connectivity. So we did that. So we started with this connectivity matrix, and the next question is, what do we put in each local area, right, to build a dynamic model? So I'm going to give you 3 versions how we went about doing that, right? So the first version is to start with this idea, very influential idea, that there's a canonical circuit that kind of repeats across the cortical mantle, even across species, right, in the mammalian kingdom. So that's saying basically that all cortical areas are the same. What's different is input-output patterns, right? Okay, how close you are to senses and how they talk to each other, right? So that definitely is true, but it's not the only answer, I think, because we do also have to think about, on the other hand, there's this idea of modular organization, right? Nancy Cambridge, for example, proposed that and showed that for a certain type of information processing, for sure, right? And also maybe in the brain, right? There's also some kind of modularity. And so we try to think about how do you square, right, between on one hand a universal kind of canonical circuit architecture. On the other hand, there's this modularity of functions. So we are going to take the view that, yes, input-output patterns are important, but also what's a bit less emphasized is that, in fact, quantitatively, there are variations from area to area, right? Heterogeneities, if you like, right? So one example would be, do genomic analysis. You will see a lot of, gene expressions that are different from area to area. So we actually started by looking at the older database, which is just the spine count. As you know, spines are the sites of accessory synapses in pyramidal cells. And there's only 1 synapse per spine. So that's very nice. You can think about the number of spines per neuron as a proxy for the strength of excitation per neuron. And that turns out to change quite a bit from area to area, as shown in the lower left panel, right, as a function of hierarchy. So actually, the change is about 10-fold, right, from V1 all the way to PFC. And so this is one example of what we call macroscopic gradients, right? So some biological properties that change from area to area are not high-dimensional heterogeneities, but they somehow show this gradients in low-dimensional, along the low-dimensional axis, right? So if you're interested, you can take a look, find out more about especially the ones that are important for excitation and inhibition, right, which we know are functionally important. We are, by this way of thinking about it, we actually found a way to use genomic data, which is still rare in computational neuroscience. So we're kind of excited by that. In a way, a big challenge is how to relate from gene to behavior through circuits, right? So we start to think about, and that's especially important if you care about psychiatric disorders, right, in computational psychiatry. Just to mention that, in my mind, this is not only a way to do it, but also a way to do it for a large-scale system. So Rishi, who was a graduate student back then, built that dynamic model, basically explained to you using the structured data, and I introduced this microscopic gradient for a dynamic model, which simply means for modelers that you use exactly the same mathematical equation for each local circuit, but then the strength of excitation is scaled by a number that's proportional to the spine count. Right? That's all. All right? And so this is a simulation of the resting state where each area is driven by noise. Right? The network is not doing anything. And then he found, right away that the time constant that dominates the dynamics is very different from area to area, as quantified here by autocorrelation function of the time series from each area, right? And shown on the lower right, the dominant time constant for like 14 areas as a function of hierarchy, right? Notice that the range is pretty big, from 20 milliseconds to more than 1 second, but it's not monotonic as a function of hierarchy, defined by hierarchy, right? So this is really a reflection of both microscopic gradient of properties and this complicated connectivity matrix properties. This kind of hierarchy of time constants is really, I think, very interesting for a number of reasons. To start with, you want early sensory areas to be very fast in order to process quickly changing external stimuli. On the other hand, when I talk about ramping activity, underlying accumulation of information in decision making, you have very slow time constants, right, in the underlying circuit. So there is now increasing evidence from single neuron recordings that there is indeed a hierarchy of time constants in monkey, shown at the top, and also mice, just a little bit lower left. And by very different measure, possibly important also, for human, say speech understanding, right? You start with very short time constants to understand the words, and then you integrate words into phrases, from phrases to sentences to narratives. And there is some evidence that that those different integrations involve somewhat distinct speech-related brain regions. So the second version of the model we did is to incorporate laminar structure. That's because, as you know, if you want to understand top-down versus bottom-up, right? Bottom-up projection originates from superficial layer, and top-down projections start with deep layers going to lower areas. And so in order to compare our model with neurophysiology, we focused on physiological studies by Earl Miller, Pascal Fries, and others, showing basically that the feed-forward processing seemed to enhance gamma oscillation related coherence, whereas top-down enhances synchrony in alpha or low beta frequency range. So I'm going to skip the details of this work just to show that and that actually led us to learn a number of things. I want to end this part just by showing a suggested schema from this work, which could be relevant to predictive coding. So this is coming derived from that study. As you know, predictive coding idea says that our brain is not passive, right? We constantly try to infer or predict what's going to happen next in the environment. So that seems to imply some kind of comparison between expectation Y and the reality X, something like X minus Y. Right? Okay. There may be several ways of doing that, but what we found a possible substrate for this is shown at the bottom. So basically, if the top-down Y signal, the expectation signal, goes to the deep layer which projects to the inhibitor neurons in the superficial layer, then change the sign from y to minus y, right? And so that can be compared with X, right? We are starting to explore, this type of circuits for predicted coding. Now, so how about working memory? So this is my third kind of version of the model right now. So now each local circuit is a full-fledged nonlinear multi-attractor network. Actually, the same model I described to you briefly at the beginning. Remember I showed an example with random dots. It's exactly the same local circuit model now incorporated into each local circuit in a large-scale system. So again, the scheme looks universal, so canonical circuit idea. And again, you have a gradient of the strengths of excitation and inhibition, right? Okay, and then we want to apply this model to distributed working memory, and 2 papers just came out. So let me just show you one example. In the model, what's useful about the computational model, I guess, is to look at different regimes. So this is one example when the local recurrent connection, even in PFC, is not strong enough to sustain persistent activity. So whatever you see should be the result of long-distance connection loops between cortical areas, right? So this is a simulation of a visual delayed response task where you put the input to V1. You should see that V1 and MT show a strong response during stimulus, but decays away right away, right? Whereas LIP and frontal areas show this sustained activity when the input is gone, right? In the lower right, you see this activity map. During the stimulus, the activity is mostly in the posterior parts of the cortex, but during the delay, you see distributed working memory that engages prefrontal cortex, parietal cortex, and some infratemporal areas. If you're now just using the same data, plot the firing rate as function of the hierarchy for all cortical areas, then it's pretty clear that those areas that are engaged in working memory, that are involved in working memory representation, are separated from those that are not by a gap, right, in the firing rate. So that, if you're familiar with dynamical systems theory, local circuit models, remind you of a bifurcation diagram. Except now, if it is a bifurcation, it's something that it's new, that I didn't really find in the mathematical literature, because we're talking about bifurcation in space, right? X-axis is the hierarchy in strongly recurrent networks, right? Different areas are talking to each other through loops, right? It's not independent, systems where you change a parameter, right? And that's not the case, right? So you have this strongly recurrent network. So one prediction about the bifurcation or phase transition in physics is this idea that you will have a divergence of time constants, the so-called critical slowing down. And indeed, we find that in abstract model, right? And that's very interesting because, as I showed you, in the resting state, the time constant that dominates dynamics should be more or less monotonic, going up along the hierarchy. But during the delay period, the model predicts, the bifurcation space idea predicts that you actually have this type of pattern for the time constant. When you're near the transition, the time constant in principle can go to infinity, right, mathematically speaking. And that can be tested in single neuron recordings. So we also found a number of self-sustained attractor states. Some of them cannot be triggered by stimulus to a sensory area, so we don't quite understand the functional meanings of those attractor states. But if you remember what I said at the beginning, I think this really is potentially is a start, right, to think about all kinds of internally driven processes involving different subsets of areas. To my surprise, certainly that the model can account basically the results of the meta-analysis from more than 90 monkey physiological studies validating this kind of approach, at least. Now, let me end with one more thing, which is how do you study distributed decision-making? So we look at signal propagation, which is an old problem in computational neuroscience, but now you revisit it in a spiking neural version of the model. And you give a very brief input to V1 and look at how spikes propagate, right, as shown on the left. Now, what's unexpected is the plot on the right, especially if you look at the peak response as function of the strength of input. For prefrontal cortex in red, there seems to be some kind of thresholding effect, right? So if you are below the threshold, basically you don't gain access to PFC. There's nothing in PFC. But if you're above it, you see, that PFC lights up, right? The system seems to become a lot more active. That's reminiscent of what's called the ignition phenomena, if you heard about it, proposed by Stanis Dehaene and others, the so-called global neuronal workspace idea for awareness. So the idea is that, actually maybe I'll show you over here. So imagine that you just do a detection task, right? This is a monkey experiment using a detection task where you just change the contrast of visual stimulus, and below is the psychometric function, right? So if you adjust the contrast right in the middle, right, near the threshold, detection threshold, now with the same physical stimulus, sometimes you see it, sometimes you don't see it, right? So in fact, there are 4 types of trials, right? You have hit, miss, but also without any stimulus, you might have correct rejection, or you can have false alarm, right? What they found in this study, recording from 4 different areas, is that in V1 and V4, neurons seem to reflect, the physical presence of stimulus in hit and miss trials, but in PFC, the activity pattern is very different depending on subjective, awareness of the stimulus, right? And so the same model that I talked to you about actually can reproduce essentially, the trend, across cortical areas. Because we're not saying that we have a model for consciousness, right? But we have a model for distributed decision-making now, perhaps, right? Started with detection, which perhaps is the simplest decision process, but we can start to think about more and more complex decision tasks. Let me maybe end by one speculative slide about abstraction, right? This is jumping, ahead, but maybe it's appropriate for this occasion. How we can really think about really simple things gradually towards more complex, more abstract abilities that are uniquely human, right? So perhaps we can think about, 2 types of abstraction. One involves more temporal trajectories, like, how do you organize cooking a meal, for example, right? Okay, in a sequence. And the other one is more in space, right? I'm thinking about work like Tim Barron's and others, how we can, or Stefano Fusi, right? How do you think about, abstraction and geometrical organization of abstraction? And maybe the combination of those 2 kinds of abstractions really underline increasingly more complex and interesting cognitive abilities. So let me end by saying again, congratulations, and I'm sure the center will become an icon of the field.
Thank you, Xiao. I think we will start with some audience questions. We have 15 minutes Q&A. And then I also have some prepared high-level, big-picture questions if we have time. But there's
Yeah.
Thank you.
You talk about autocorrelation times in these different regions, and I think that's getting at sort of a related question to your sort of starting point, where you've posited that this sort of internal life of the mind may be sort of generated in these higher level areas. Do you have data on sort of spontaneous patterns of activity that are present outside of stimuli in cortices like the prefrontal cortex that may drive this sort of cogitation?
Yeah, I did show a slide of, tests of this hierarchy of time constants using single neuron data. So people have looked at that, but I think you're more asking if you put the electrode in, let's say, humans' speech areas, do you see this internal integration process? I'm sure there will be those kind of data, but I don't think, I think it's start point. We're just starting to get this kind of data. That there's also just to mention that even in simple working memory tasks, I'm thinking about a nice work by John Murray, articulating that during the delay, there's a manipulation of information. Maybe you're doing some logical computations, converting from here to there, and that's internal computation, right? And you could look at time constants in different parts of the brain during this process. And yeah.
Beautiful, very interesting talk. I wonder how you've talked mainly about cortical connectivity and spatial maps and so on. Well, thank you. I started with a compliment. It's a beautiful talk. And then you have spoken of cortical connectivity mainly and the kinds of maps that one can find, either spatial or temporal. I just wonder, there are so many recurrent loops from down below the neocortex proper.
Of
and
course.
sorry to ask, but
Sure.
they give every appearance of being extremely powerful and having some of the properties that you've ascribed to the neocortex itself, including distributedness and modularity.
Yeah, so, I mentioned, thank you, Anne, for that point. Definitely, of course, subcortical structures are important. I mentioned that we started using this new database from Kennedy's group. Of course, ideally, we hope that we could use connectivity data obtained using the same type of measurement. So it will be uniform, right? High quality data. And to my knowledge, those data are not quite available yet, quantified. I'm sure you did a lot of anatomy. Susan Haber, for example, had a lot of data, but not quite in the same format, same kind of quantification. We'd love to do that. That said, right, you have indeed the same kind of data for mice, right? So we started to actually also build a model for multi-regional model of the mice brain, including subcortical structures. Actually, we also started to look at plasticity in the model. It's very exciting, I think. Yeah, Michael.
Xiao, yeah, great talk. So, as you know, there's been a lot of work showing sequences in different parts of the brain and cortex. Gilles Laurent just recently had a really beautiful paper showing long sequential activations in intact turtle brain. Do you think there's a connection between the time scale on which sequences could persist in these different hierarchical areas? I mean, you've focused on persistent activity, but sequences are a different form of persistent activity. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Not a lot. So that definitely is a very interesting open question to us, especially when you think about multi-regional systems. Maybe just to mention that, Uri Hansen, I showed the one plot by his work on human speech. He used the term time integration as if it's like a sequence, right, in speech, it's a sequence. But there's no real mechanistic kind of models, at least in this context. I know, of course, there are beautiful works on local circuits, in songbirds and in parietal cortex, right, with David Tank. So we start to think about this, but we don't really have clear ideas. I mean, one interesting question is that you have this canonical circuit organization, right? And then the question is, how do you endow and how do you explain different areas that may operate in different dynamical, regimes or modes, right? Sequence versus oscillations versus, some other type of dynamical regimes.
Okay, cool. So,
Ela.
sorry, Ela, I was hoping to ask some general questions, but.
Yeah, I mean, maybe this is partly a general question, so I'll ask it. Jing, I have, I guess, two general questions for you. So one is, I guess, related to Michael's question. So, there is this hierarchy that you described beautifully, and it was, really interesting modeling work on that front. And so I guess Michael's question is about, as you go up the hierarchy, do you see longer and longer sequences? And an alternative question related to that is, I mean, is that the way that we should think about hierarchy, or should we think about hierarchy as in maybe we should expect to see similar length sequences or similar types of activation in the different areas, but maybe they're representing bigger and bigger chunks of the world?
Yep.
And so to the point of your plots, you did see an increase in time scale as you go up, and you showed us your computational plots where you get this divergence of time scales. But divergence is, I mean, it's very fine tuned to get very long time scales. But at the same time, I can think about things on, seconds, minutes, days,
Yeah.
years, decades. And so where are those, that's something that's always puzzled me. Where are those hierarchies? Like, where do we get 6 orders of magnitude? Do you think that's coming from the same processes? Or do you think that when we think cognitively about 6 orders of magnitude in time, it's something else?
Yeah. So I'd love to talk more offline, maybe more,
Yeah.
but let me just quickly try to answer your question. I actually, now I think about it, maybe just to offer my current, take, which, may, it's just take, is that if you really think about sequence, I want to think about 2 kinds of sequences. One is really like, place cell kind of sequence, right, in real time. The other one is kind of transitions between quasi-stable states. That's different kind of, I think, sequence, perhaps more relevant to behavior or thoughts, right? Behavior, by that I mean maybe movements, right? A sequence of discrete movement primitives. So I don't know if you are thinking about the first type or the second type. So about the time constants is more relevant for the first type, right? So I mentioned the example of predictive coding. So for example, this would be a really, I think it's a good example. So if you try to predict when you watch a movie, you need to know the temporal context, what happened before. So that's why you need this long time constant in higher areas that has this information about the past to tell the downstream system what to expect, right? So that's the, I guess, one thing.
And I guess the question I was asking is mechanism. Like, do you
Yeah,
think
so
that we
I
understand
wanna really
mechanism
wanna
for
say-
getting
sorry.
very long time scales? Like,
Yeah, so I want to really say this. This critical slowing down does not need any tuning or parameters. That's especially thing about the bifurcation in space, because if you like, it's like your parameters in space, right? So if you change any parameters, you may move that location a bit, but it's always there.
you always get the long time scales. Very cool.
Right. I'll just take the remaining 2 minutes, ask a general question. This is kind of unusual, but can you tell us something, maybe a story about the human side behind the science? We have lots of junior people here. Is there some difficulty that you and people in your group had to overcome to do some of these sciences, or?
Whoa.
Or maybe I can give you a prompt, given that
All right.
So the first.
Let me actually, I don't mind. This may be, yeah, go ahead.
So the first part and the second part is pretty different, right? So when you're starting the research of the second part, what are some challenges there? Is there any challenge finding, essentially starting a new direction?
Yeah, maybe I actually will start with the first one. I mean, I don't mind to tell you. Is that what you're asking? A bit more personal question?
Oh, yeah.
So how did I get into PFC, right? I guess the long and short of it is that I switched from physics to neuroscience, as Robert mentioned, in the lab of Walter Freeman at UC Berkeley. It turns out that his father was the infamous Walter Freeman, who undertook frontal lobotomies for thousands of people, including the sister of JFK, Rosemary Kennedy. So I got to learn about the PFC in his lab, kind of telling about the stories. And then probably I lost my job. I couldn't find a place to go. And I went to Woods Hole to a summer school. That was the first time that course took place. And that's where I met John Rinzo. I was telling him I don't have any place to go after the summer school. And he facilitated, helped me to find a place in his group. And I actually started to meet with Bob, if you remember, at NIH. And I started to talk to psychiatrists. That's how I got into, what the mystery of PFC, very accidentally.
Yeah, thank you, Xiao. Thank you.